Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today's guests are Mark Hannant and Munni Trivedi. They're the co-founders of Team Magenta, which is based in Mumbai, and Indigo Creative Process Outsourcing, which is based out of London. Munni is also the managing director of Indigo CPO. So welcome to the Subjective Space, Mark and Munni.
Hello, very nice to be here.
Very nice to see you again. Thank you.
Oh, I also have to say Mark is also an author, and he's appeared in 2 Bollywood films. So that's another thing to add. But first, before we get into all the questions, I have to address the elephant in the room, right? When we're talking about creative outsourcing in the times of AI. So my first question is, I know on the Magenta website, there is the thing that says, for the parts of marketing that have no algorithm. So I want to ask you first, is AI a threat or a tool for better communications? Why should agencies hire, designers and copywriters when they could invest instead in like prompt engineers and like AI and other tech? So that's my first question.
So interestingly, the piece that you reference on the website, for the parts of marketing that have no algorithm, was written by a former colleague of ours, a guy called Aditya Nair. And I noticed via LinkedIn that Aditya won an award over the weekend as a prompt engineer. So he picked up this award in Dubai, and he now works in an AI startup. The whole sort of idea around that concept was this, that we're a human first business and creativity is a sort of core skill where humans have an advantage because we have empathy, we have shared experience, and we have intuition, which is clearly a different thing from prediction. So I think, we're making use of a wide variety of technologies, and we may come and talk a bit more about what some of those are, but it's always with a friendly human face. Mm-hmm. Your question, the second part of your question, I think, was, is it a threat or an opportunity? I think it's both. We see lots of places where there are opportunities to use technology in order to be more efficient, particularly in doing things at scale. Our colleagues back in India are doing a lot of work experimenting with a variety of different Gen AI tools, but also other technologies which are around compliance, for example. So, our view has always been that it's a blend, right? So that a blend of human activity and, the technology. And, the reality, I think, still is that ChatGPT, for example, still doesn't write very good copy. I mean, because by definition, all it's doing is kind of predicting what the next word should be. And it's simply scraping all of the content which has already been in existence. So it's in itself not originating new things. And I use a little tool, which you may have seen before, actually, which is called the Gunning Fog Index. And it's a way, back in the day when I was sort of training as a journalist, you used to have to do the calculation yourself. In other words, you had to take a piece of copy and you had to count how many words there were, how many words with more than 3 syllables, what the punctuation was. And then there was this little algorithm, essentially, that you had to calculate the readability of that copy. Now, of course, you can simply drop that into a web browser and it will instantaneously give you a number. And I use that on a daily basis to check the readability of copy, whether I'm writing it or, I'm editing it or one of my colleagues is writing it. And I also now drop it into ChatGPT and ask it to come up with, a piece of copy with the same brief. And ChatGPT typically writes about twice as long. The sentence structure is really long. It's very kind of formulaic. So, I still think that there's an important role for the human, both in originating and in editing copy.
I think, I would agree. I think it's here to stay. So, there's no point in fighting with it. So let's use it. Be aware of the limitations. If we were having this conversation a year ago, the things we'd be talking about were very different. And, so that rate of change and adoption, it's just so fast. So I think I mean, there's a great example of a colleague of mine who used it to find every campaign in for a brand, to then be able to find the white space. Now, all best will in the world, a human will miss something. You can't, if it's a global brand, know everything it's done. So, but then you still need the human in there to look at everything. Why was that used there? Why was that, used in this territory? And then find the white space and what can we do that hasn't been done. Mm-hmm. So I think it's using that blend, use it as a tool, be aware of the limitations, and just use it to your advantage.
I think something that Mark said, and before what you just said, stood out for me about how ChatGPT can sometimes be very verbose. It's like you need a human to sort of edit it after it's done its work.
Well, as you know, I've spent a lot of my professional career, editing other people's copy and being quite ruthless with it. When anything that comes to me that's had ChatGPT involved in it, I just have to be even more kind of ruthless with it.
Yeah.
There's an interesting quote, which I'm going to paraphrase, but it's from a guy called Karim Lakhani, who's at Harvard Business School, and he recently established a new institute called the Digital Data Design Institute at Harvard, and we've had quite a lot of interaction with them over the last kind of couple of years. Karim's comment is this: AI won't take your job, but somebody that uses AI probably will. So again, I think it's that sort of blend, right? So again, as Munni says, we're in no way Luddites. We welcome it and are spending quite a lot of time and energy and resources in terms of thinking about how you can integrate that into the sort of practice of communications. I was on a train journey, just arriving back in London this morning, and I did ask ChatGPT to answer the various questions that you had suggested we might talk about. And it wasn't any good. So I'm sort of feeling that there's still a role for us.
Yeah, I think Munni, what you said is right. Like, you must have seen over the years in your own experience, like so much tech that's come up that you have to integrate. Yeah. You can't run away from it.
Exactly. And, the way that we are executing lots of the output that we create is so different. But humans are at the heart of it. I sort of go back to a really old example of when trains were invented. So suddenly the horse and carriage drivers, had to upskill and reskill to learn how to drive a train, or go and do something else. Yeah. So, technology is always coming in and you have to be aware of it, but use it to your advantage, and it can be a lot of good.
I think the other thing to add is that AI and its sort of arrival in the mainstream over the last 18 months or so has sort of diverted the conversation. There's a whole load of other interesting technology stuff happening, right, which nobody's really talking about. So there's a lot of work that Munni's doing with her teams in terms of using what we probably call virtual desktop environments, where you're able to, again, this addresses the sort of compliance issue. So there's some quite sophisticated tools that allow you to, they're probably blockchain based, but they're about being able to show who's touched a piece of data at any kind of given time. And those are other tools that we're very much sort of integrating into the work that we do. But it doesn't seem to get so much of the oxygen. All of the oxygen is sucked up by Gen AI.
Yeah, I think it's because it's sort of like it's intimidating, right? So it's people are like, oh my God, it's going to take away my job. Like, all I do is write or design or whatever, and it's going to take away my job. But
I mean, one of the things that I sometimes reflect on is the fact that it may sort of seem intimidating. It can't be that complicated because all it uses is noughts and ones.
Yeah,
it's a binary at the end of the day.
Yeah, I know. Hopefully it does not have feelings. So I want to ask you about your journey next. For those who are listening, Mark and Munni started off, in London, and then they moved to India. They moved to Bombay, where they worked for 15 years. And now they're back in London again. So my question is, I guess, when you moved from the UK to India in the beginning, what was it about like UK marketing culture or communications culture that you consciously like brought to India? And after all of these years, in India, like what was a radical change for you when you moved from the UK to India? What was like, oh my God, for you? And when you move back now from India back to the UK, what sort of desi communication philosophies did you bring back here now? So I guess I'm asking you the intercultural sort of inspirations, experiences. Tell me about that. Whoever wants to take
So
it.
first of all, I like the fact that you call it Bombay. We also call it Bombay. You know, there's
Yeah.
this saying, Mumbai is a place, Bombay is a feeling.
Right.
And we've always kind of subscribed to that. I remember I first went to India and went to Mumbai, Bombay, more than 20 years ago, and just absolutely loved it. I love the vibe, the energy, the sort of entrepreneurial spirit. I think Mumbai is in many ways similar to New York. It's got that sort of entrepreneurial buzz. Everybody's kind of from somewhere else. You'll get meetings. If there's a good idea, let's see if we can do something. If not, everybody gets on with their lives. We found ourselves or created a situation for ourselves where we'd sold a business in the UK. We had some seed money. We had 2 very young children. We said, let's go and have an adventure. And so we rocked up in Bombay, 2 small kids, 2 suitcases, and sort of set up a business on our...
And the cookery books.
And set up a dining room table. And we kind of gave ourselves 2 years and said, let's see if we think it's viable. And if it's viable, then it's probably a sort of 10-year project. Anyway, 15 years later, we're still splitting our time between London and Mumbai. And it's been a lot of fun.
It has. And, the learning along the way, things that we hadn't really expected. I was sort of not expecting to have to fight quite so much for space. And because I've grown up in quite an egalitarian family, and then in the world of work in the UK, actually, I've not had to fight for space. I've not had to, in the way that, some women do, is, it comes naturally. But in India, it's, and you'll have experienced some of that yourself when you've been there, that, and then, I sound like this, but I look like them, and I, don't necessarily...
People are confused. They're like, what do I expect from you?
Exactly. And then, so sometimes I used to just revert to speaking in Gujarati, because then the guards come down and you could find a connection with people. And so sometimes you have to use other methods to reach across the, perceived divide.
I guess I want to ask you, was it good to have Mark with you then? Like, people are like fascinated by this guy who's like, okay, this British guy who's come here, and like he definitely has something good to offer.
I won't lie. And that's one of the great ironies of India, I think, that despite the whole colonial hang up and, being ruled by the Britishers for X number of years, and, there is still a cachet. And so, Mark has some status being a middle-aged, man of a certain age, white, English. They like his accent, that kind of thing. Oh, he must be clever, and he must know things because he is a Britisher.
Yeah.
And so, I won't lie, that does help to open doors. But
I would go further than that, actually. I mean, I recognise the fact that I had immense privilege in India for those reasons that Munni described: male, old, white. But now, in some instances, I mean, what that gives in professional terms, it means I have a lot of access, right? So I can get meetings in boardrooms, and not so much with politicians, because that's not the world that we kind of operate in. But in a sense, there's a sort of demand and an interest in me, which we probably hadn't sort of thought that through. I think this was one of the bits that Munni was alluding to earlier on, was that we thought that as a brown woman who speaks Indian languages, it would be easy for her to go and live there. And it wasn't in many ways, right? There were lots of assumptions and expectations around her, which I think, I know were challenging.
Yeah.
So it wasn't it wasn't, perhaps always as easy as we might have expected it to. But I mean, ultimately, it was just a big adventure.
Yeah.
Right? So and we've had, as I said, a lot of fun. There were two
Mm.
sort of motivating factors, really. There was the family side of things, right? We've got two young children. They're both English and Indian, and we choose to use that phraseology in terms of them being both rather than them being half of anything. And we wanted them to know their Indian-born cousins. In the days of the Raj, an Englishman would have sent his children back from India to England to do their education. Anyway, we decided that we'd do it the other way around, and we would take
Yeah.
our children to India, and they've been educated there. And it's, as you know, right, an Indian education gives you a firm footing in life.
Oh, definitely.
It might not at
Yeah.
the time be all that much fun, but
Mm.
actually, it gives a very good grounding. So
Yeah.
there was a sort of family side of it. We wanted an adventure, but from a business perspective, we saw two significant opportunities. One of which was around India as a market, fast growing. Historically, communications hasn't really been valued, right, as a discipline in India. There are other things that young people were encouraged to go and study. Communications kind of wasn't there. Design wasn't really there, wasn't taken seriously. So we felt that there was something of a gap in the market, that our international experience would be welcomed. So that was sort of idea number one. And idea number two was that we'd run, quite significant agency businesses in other parts of the world, and we understood what the economics of that were. And we thought we could probably, there's a bunch of stuff that an agency does that could be done from a lower cost destination. And so the sort of outsourcing piece.
It made sense. And, I'd say that, Mark comes from an editorial background. I've got the studio production. I ran studios in various London agencies. He was heading up editorial departments. So we brought different things, which were, sort of yin yang, and, we could bring, it created a really interesting, bigger whole. W.
I know that you've been doing like demand and supply side of agencies and, all of that in the past. And transforming workflows is something that you've been really interested in. So tell me more about that. Like when you brought this idea to India, how much of it did you really have to sort of twist and change to suit that market? I know Mark has also worked, I think in the UK. I think you've also built businesses in the US, if I'm not wrong, and Singapore as well. So what was it about India as a market that was specific, that you had to really tweak to cater to this market? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. Do you want me to go first?
Go on, you go first. See if we're going to say the same thing.
Well, I think, our sort of general thesis at the time, right, was that there was interest in the international experience that we've got, right? And we worked with some pretty sort of significant, in the sort of B2B world, some fairly kind of significant businesses. So we felt that we understood what, global best practice was in terms of communications activity. And there was, for sure, a demand for that. Because I think, particularly 15 years ago, you've got an interesting dynamic where you've got some big Indian companies who were going out and creating international footprints, recognized the fact that they needed some support with their communications, weren't finding the talent necessarily that they wanted at home. And so there was a receptiveness to that. I think, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I do think that, one of the things that we now recognize is the fact that there's actually interesting innovation happening in India, and that has applications in other parts of the world. So whereas the sort of original thing was to take international best practice to India, I think one of the opportunities now is to take innovation that happens in India and spread the word about that.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, that yes, it's a low cost market, it's a low cost economy, but I've been on the buyer side, and there's no point in shifting it just because it's going to be cheaper. If you're going to get a whole load of ag, further down the line, or you don't get what you want or when you need it, because you're making commitments to your clients on the back of promises that are being made. So what we also saw was there was, a great supply of skills. So, a huge English speaking collegiate that could, that their English, they've been taught English properly. I'm just going to use this as an example. So they know where the apostrophe goes. They know that the preposition shouldn't be at the end of a line. So, when we give proofreading, comes back right first time. So those sort of skills, which are not always that readily available in the West, and it's expensive. If someone's going to be good, they're going to charge for it. Whereas that's much more readily available in the East, in India, and that together with the work ethic, they do it with a smile on their face. They stay and make sure the job gets done and delivered. Is a great combination.
I think that's another question I had for you about Indian stretchable time, right? Like in your experience in India, how has it been? Because I know Indians work very hard. I know they put in a lot of effort, but also time is very stretchable. So, what is your experience been about that? Because like you were just saying, how things have to be delivered on time, and people expect things to happen. And when you're doing these international sort of things, everything, you have to really be aligned with everybody else. So, what has your experience been like in India? Do you think things happen at the end of the day on time, whatever happens? Yeah,
they do, and we've always impressed on our teams that don't tell, because there's a part of the Indian psyche is they tell you what they think you want to hear. I want to hear the truth. I don't want to, I don't then want, when it should be delivering, going, oh, actually, I can't, So we've made that as one of our policies, is that you tell me by when you can deliver this. And
I will hold it.
Yes. So, so they then, they've learned to, the teams have learned to make sure they're honest with us. We go back to our clients and we always, acknowledge receipt of the email. So they're not thinking, oh my gosh, it's so far away. And, did they get it? Did they get it? No, they've got it. They'll tell me.
Yeah.
And, so we deliver when we say we're going to deliver. And we add value. So if we've done something to it, because we are the experts in this thing, so we'll say why we've done this, and then that's adding the value of, oh yeah, that makes sense.
I describe it, Sindhu, as a translation layer, right? Which is, you take advantage of the fact that they've got that whole notion of Indian stretchable time. Things can be done. Sometimes it all gets a bit hairy. Client doesn't need to know that, but you need to deliver work to them in a way in which they're expecting it in a time frame that they're expecting, right? And actually, our ability, particularly Munni's ability, having sat in the hot seat in London agencies, means that she understands what their expectations are, and she can translate that right into the studio. It's not a language translation, but it's a cultural translation, right? Being able to then make sure that there's a confluence, if you will, in terms of the way in which the work is delivered, and that's meeting people's expectations. But I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that India is not an easy place to do business for reasons which you will know and understand, right? There's a whole load of sort of friction that's what I think of as the sort of hidden costs of doing business in India. But I'm not disadvantaged because of the colour of my skin. There, everybody has that, right? Being an entrepreneur in India is not an easy thing. To be honest, being an entrepreneur anywhere is not an easy thing, right? Running businesses is hard work. And so some elements of India which make that perhaps give it a little bit more kind of pressure. But there are also things which, again, about people's willingness, the very, very sort of positive work culture, the fact that you can do things at scale that give you something of an advantage.
I guess my next question was about, how India has changed in terms of, is it still a great sought after place for creative outsourcing? Like, is it, what has changed over there in the last 15 years? Like Munni said, you are bringing this sort of culture to India, but then now there's so much stuff that you can take from here to the rest of the world. So tell me more about that. What is that exactly? And sort of, how you're, pitching it to the rest of the world now, I guess.
So I would say that the creative outsourcing is relatively new-ish. It's not this year's thing, but where other kinds of outsourcing, what started as the BPO, call centers, has moved to knowledge process outsourcing, and now we're taking those those thinkings and moving into the creative sphere and carving a niche for ourselves, which is in the early days, you know, when we were talking to people going, yeah, it makes sense, but I don't want to be first. You know, they could understand, yes, okay, I can see you've got a team there, they're experienced, they can do this, but I want someone else. Now, much more willingness to send something there. They know that they're going to get the quality. You know, we've been here for 15 years, so they can see that we've been churning this work out, and it's not just churning, it's right and it's good quality and it's as the client wanted it. So that willingness to adopt a different way of manning your studio, of getting that work done and delivered, there's much more acceptance of that.
I think there are two sides to that. One of which is that there are things that have changed in the world. I'll come back to that. And there are secondly things that have changed about India. So, you know, again, if you think over the last 4 years in particular, the whole idea of remote work has become mainstream, right? Enlarged, driven by the pandemic and lockdown.
Yeah.
So, you know, now nobody bats an eyelid about a member of staff not being in the office. The question then is, if that person, does it matter whether that person is 4 miles away or 4,500 miles away, right? People are just much, much more willing to see work done in different places, to, you know, cut up workflows, take things out, put them in other places. Right? So there's a much more sort of dynamic thinking around the way in which work gets done. And I find that very exciting. It also happens to play into our, you know, own sort of business operations. But the second thing is that, you know, India has changed significantly in the last 15 years, right? And whereas 15 years ago, it was very much a sort of cost arbitrage. You could get stuff done cheaper there. Now I think India offers that still, but you've also got a skills and scale opportunity. You can do things at large scale in India. There is a surplus of young, skilled people, literate, numerate, and they're all kind of consuming the same content, right? So they're all our now 16-year-old daughter, you know, has grown up in India, but she's watching exactly the same content as her cousins and contemporaries back here. When she's in India, when she's here, she's watching the same stuff as her mates are there, right? So again, the production values have lifted. And so, you know, those questions that Munni suggested around, you know, sort of quality, I think have gone away. So whereas 15 years ago, my job was to try and convince people about India, now it's not so much about convincing them, it's about working with them to figure out how you're going to integrate that, if you like, into their workflows. So I think it's changed in a number of different ways.
And
I think now, I was just going to say now is a good time for Mark to probably talk about Midnight's grandchildren, how young Indians are disrupting the world's largest democracy.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate. Somebody invited me to write that. I'd done a presentation in London, and there was a publisher there from Routledge who said, "Oh, I think that might make a good subject for a book." And of course, your ego kicks in, and you say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that. I'll write the book." And then reality bites, and you think, "Oh shit, actually, it's going to take up a lot of my time and energy." And you know, Munni was, you know, good enough to sort of step in and look after the business for a year while I went off and, you know, did the writing. I essentially interviewed 70 people. It was the 70th anniversary of Indian independence. My sort of central thesis was this, that India experienced two moments of transformation in the 20th century, 1947 in independence, and then, you know, 1991 and the opening up, the liberalising of the economy. And there's a whole cadre of millennials, 440 million of them, you're one of them, who've grown up in an era that was very different from that which your parents experienced, right? So the parental generation had had austerity, lack of opportunity, and you and your cohort were growing up in an era of rapid economic growth, prosperity, opportunity, and abundance. And I thought that made quite an interesting sort of area for research and discussion. And so I went out, interviewed a bunch of people. And, you know, in essence, I've said this on several occasions, you know, the work was to then string that together, right, and make an interesting narrative out of it, rather than, you know, having to sort of originate ideas as you would do if you were doing creative writing, which I know is, you know, much closer to your own sort of work. But I enjoyed doing it. It got some positive reviews, and it has resulted in lots of invitations to go and speak in different places. Right, so it's been very good. I would recommend to people, a book gets you access. Being an author, having a book gets you access to a whole bunch of different places that you would not have been invited to had you not had the book. And I also sort of identified a number of what I thought were quite interesting brands that I thought had sort of captured the moment and really kind of appealed to that aspirational young Indian. So Royal Enfield is an example of that, a dying British brand which was reimagined by an Indian owner. They made a very sort of experiential, consumer story out of that.
Yeah, that was a good brand for sure. Yeah. Have
Yeah.
some good memories of it myself.
Yeah, so young people, there's lots of cheaper ways to get from A to B, right? But a Royal Enfield bike really sort of says something. It gives you a personality and character, and I think it gives a sense of freedom and independence to people, right? And I think those sort of brands, I think, really kind of have huge potential in India at the moment, because people want to state their independence, but they also are cautious about being outcast, about being outsiders, right? So in a way that a Harley Davidson makes you an outsider, I don't think that's what young Indians are looking for. Where an Enfield kind of gives you a flavour of that, but without the outsider status.
And you can hear it coming a mile off. It's great.
Yeah, for sure.
And one of the other ones, I mean, there's a whole list of brands that I identified. I'll speak about one other, which was Indigo, the airline, which has since then sort of become the world's fastest growing airline in the world's fastest growing aviation market. And it's a super product, right? It's very much tailored to people who are new to brands, who are new to travel, right? It's an easy experience, because travel isn't always an easy experience, right? There's bureaucracy and queues and people wanting to look at your passports and your bags and all this kind of stuff, right? And India, I think, has made that as smooth experience as is possible.
For 1 billion people, I mean, that's a lot of people.
Right?
Yeah.
When I'm in India, I'll always fly Indigo for my domestic flights, unless there isn't an Indigo option. So Bhavnagar, for example, in Gujarat, where we have family, you have to travel with another airline.
It is Air India. I've done it on Kingfisher, which is an interesting experience.
But, getting to, an Indian airport early in the morning and just sort of being surrounded by these young, enthusiastic, ambitious young people with fancy new trainers and nice backpacks on, it's really kind of invigorating, right? And it's fundamentally different from the experience of trying to travel around in India 15 years ago. I use that just as one example of how the transformation of India has occurred over that time frame.
Actually, on that, I remember when we moved there, because we had to learn how to, where'd you go to buy a litre of milk and all that. But when we needed to get somewhere, and India has a whole system of agents. So we used to have to go to an agent to book a flight or a bus or a this or a that for us. Now, you've got an array of apps. You pay on your payment wallet, or, you swipe your card, or, it's that digital transformation is, it's 180. It's so far. I've then come back to England, not Greece, but back when I came on a trip, and I was like, what do you mean I have to swipe my card? What do you mean?
Yeah.
And so you get so used to it. It has just developed. And also that's the other side of there being a young population there, because the adoption and the willingness to try these new devices or platforms, or, whereas somewhere, in the West, there's maybe a little bit more resistance.
Right. I think that's a good place for me to bring in, like we were talking about, how people are adopting these digital things much quicker in India and the younger population. And talking about women in India, right? Because that's another thing, that women have also adopted all of these things in India, but maybe not to that scale. But, they've also come online and they've adopted these technologies. So within agency culture, or within the world of marketing and communications, over all of these years. What has changed in India, do you think, for women working in these spaces? Has it become easier for them? Has it become, have these agencies and, spaces made it easier for women to thrive and grow? Or do you still see, what are the problems and what are the sort of opportunities?
From an anecdotal point of view, yes, I see lots of women of all ages, actually, in communications agencies. When I go to meetings, I have also been the only woman in the room. So while there is change and it is moving, and there are lots of women that you can name in very senior roles, and you get good FaceTime from them, and they're spokeswomen for their brands. There's still a long way to go, because I think where there's more representation in many spheres, parliamentarians, etc. It's still only a small proportion. So men still outnumber by a long chalk. You've got women's double day of work. There's still societal expectations on women which are different to those on men. And so I remember at COVID, something that I hadn't quite realised, you've got this work from home culture. But for many women, the fact that they went to the office meant they had respect, and they had a space that they could go and do their thing. When they were in the domestic environment trying to do the same thing, they had other limitations. They maybe have
lesser time to do their work.
Yeah, it was. And whereas maybe societally men wouldn't have those pressures on them. So I mean, that COVID was a certain time, but if we look at things like storylines, which is the thing I was going to say earlier, you've got more Asian characters coming through now. Being back in the UK, I can see Asian dramas being more available. So the presence of Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, there's a whole world over that side of the world, isn't there? We can't map them all into one.
That's so diverse. Yeah, it's just not one Asia.
And so I think definitely it's moving in the right direction. There's a lot more presence of women, lots more platforms that women can then put themselves forward or be put forward. And with the cohort of younger men coming up supporting.
That's important too.
Yes, and their expectations now that there is more equality and there is more that I think that all works. That's all working in the right direction, but the road ahead is still a long one.
Well, the economic opportunity for India is massive, right? If you bring many of those women who've been excluded from the workforce into the labour market, right, then it really has the potential to power India's growth over the next, 2 or 3 decades. So there's lots of good reasons why that should happen. But, as you well know, there are lots of cultural barriers to it as well.
Yeah, there is the economic reason for why it should be done. It's like the more practical, the more, it's a good reason to say this is why women should be doing all of this stuff. So we're reaching almost the end of our episode. But before we go, I want you guys to give us some advice, some sort of, I remember, Mark, you said the ABC of copywriting, which we said in the beginning about AI not, adopting or understanding any of that and being extremely verbose. So I guess my advice, you'd give for humans about some things to remember, especially if you're going to, work out of these sort of international spaces, right? The world is one global space now, I guess. So some marketing advice from both of you.
You got some advice?
Oh, who am I to give advice?
I think while Munni's thinking about that, I have learned not to give unsolicited advice. However, since you've solicited it, I will remind your audience of the ABC: accuracy, brevity, and clarity.
Yeah.
which, for anybody writing in any sphere, right? You don't have to be a professional writer, but anybody that has to communicate does well to remember those things. My other piece of advice, which I always sort of weave into any sort of corporate presentation that I'm giving, talking to students, or even in some sort of pitch environments, is to talk about Epictetus. I don't know if you know who Epictetus is.
No.
He was one of the Stoic philosophers, and the Stoic philosophers are something that I've spent quite a bit of time sort of reading about and thinking about over the last few years. Anyway, Epictetus said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in proportion. The idea being that we should spend more time listening and less time speaking. And, I think, again, there are lots of scenarios where that's a beneficial approach. So that is my sort of one piece of communications advice. 2
That's a good
ears,
one.
1
Yeah.
mouth, use them in proportion.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something similar, but maybe not quite as eloquently, but he's the writer, not me, which is to listen, actually. Ask questions. So I always try and get the other person, to tell me what your pain point is. Quite often I ask, what is it, if you've got a current relationship with a supplier, or, where would you like them to do it differently? Or in an ideal scenario, ask questions, and then stop and listen, because generally they will tell you everything you need to know to make that pitch to them.
Yeah.
What is
I think
it?
that's important.
What flavor do they really like, or what would make their life easy? So yeah.
Of course, I completely failed to apply that in my own personal life.
I'm saying no.
So
you guys are great together, though. I mean, I probably should have asked you this at some point, but I can ask you now. Is that, what is it like working together for all of these years? I mean, how is it like? Do you bring work back home, or do you, like, once you're back home, you're just like, you're not going to talk about work anymore?
I think, so first of all, I think we're good communicators, right? And I do listen. So, I think that sort of, communication is absolutely, the foundational skill, if you will, to be able to do what we've done, which is to be married for almost 25 years and to have run 2 businesses and, brought up a couple of kids. So, I think that's it. But it's not easy at all, right? And you have to work at it all the time, as in any long-term relationship, whether or not you're, also co-founders of businesses or not. So it's hard work. Money's actually sort of drafting an idea for a book, which is to interview co-founders who are also life partners.
Oh, nice.
Because we've met quite a number along the way, and some of them are still partners, and some of them are not. And
I can imagine.
That might actually be quite an interesting, sort of topic for a book. So anyway, I've written mine. She can now take a year off and go and write about that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's
what we did was, we carve out time, because what you don't want is Saturday morning over breakfast. Oh, do you know that letter? Can you just tell me what? Don't let it infect home life. And because if we worked at different places and you wouldn't have that conversation. So we sort of try and segment it so that we carve out a time in a week which is sacrosanct, and we go and talk about home stuff that we need to, you've got, the garden needs doing, or whatever it is, and then there's other times when we have a separate meeting just to talk about the business, which is not the day-to-day stuff, but there might be some admin or whatever that needs sorting. So we carve out those points where all that stuff can actually be talked about, so it doesn't then infect or get into other areas of your life, and you can try and do the fun bit.
My advice is this: that the key to a successful and long relationship is twofold: gin and marijuana.
I mean, I'm on that.
All right then.
Yeah, I mean, Canada. It's cannabis is legal in Canada, right? So
What's not to love?
Yeah, what's not to love? But that's great. Thank you so much, Mark and Munni. I think you guys were really like very candid and shared a lot of information, which is good for, people from all sorts of industries. So thank you so much for joining me, and thanks,
Well,
Mark.